What if Earth suddenly stopped spinning, not slowing down, not gradually, but instantly, in a single moment that changes everything forever? Right now, you are moving at over 1,600 kilometers per hour, even if you are standing completely still on the ground. That motion is invisible, but it is constant, and everything on Earth shares that same rotational speed together. If the planet stopped instantly, the ground beneath you would stop, but your body would continue moving at full speed. That means you would be violently thrown sideways faster than a jet aircraft with no warning and no time to react. Buildings, vehicles, oceans, and even the atmosphere would continue moving at thousands of kilometers per hour. Everything not firmly anchored to the Earth's crust would be instantly torn away by the force of inertia. The entire surface of the planet would experience a global shockwave of motion unlike anything in human history. This would not feel like an earthquake. It would feel like the entire world is being ripped sideways at impossible speed. And this is only the first second, because what happens next is far more destructive than the initial impact. When Earth stops, the atmosphere does not stop with it, because the air is already moving with the planet's rotation. Near the equator, that moving air could keep racing at roughly the speed the surface used to spin beneath it. This would create winds faster than the strongest hurricanes ever measured, sweeping across continents like an atmospheric wall. The wind would not simply blow things over, it would sandblast cities with debris moving faster than aircraft. Windows, towers, bridges, power lines, and forests would be stripped apart by air that suddenly becomes a global weapon. Even if you survived the first sideways impact, the atmosphere itself would become impossible to breathe through safely. Dust, ocean spray, smoke, ice, and broken structures would fill the sky, turning daylight into a choking storm. Aircraft already in the air would face violent crosswinds, broken navigation, and an atmosphere behaving like a moving ocean. The most dangerous part is that this wind would happen everywhere, not as weather, but as physics catching up. Earth stopping would turn the air above us into the first global disaster, long before oceans and climates finished changing. If Earth stopped spinning, the oceans would not calmly stay where they are, because water also carries rotational momentum. Like the atmosphere, seawater would continue moving eastward, smashing into coastlines with unimaginable force and speed. Entire coastlines would be hit by mega tsunamis, not from earthquakes, but from the ocean refusing to stop instantly. Ports, beaches, islands, and low-lying cities would be erased as oceans surge far beyond their normal boundaries. The sea would rush across continents, carrying ships, debris, buildings, and everything once sitting safely near the shore. But the disaster would not end with one wave, because stopping rotation would also change where ocean water naturally settles. Without centrifugal force from rotation, water would slowly migrate away from the equator toward the polar regions. This could expose vast new land near the equator while drowning enormous areas closer to the poles. Maps of Earth would become unrecognizable as oceans redraw continents more violently than any human border ever could. The planet would not just stop moving, it would reshape its oceans and rewrite the surface of the world. The next disaster would hit human civilization directly, because almost nothing we have built was designed for Earth to stop moving. Skyscrapers are built to handle wind, gravity, and earthquakes, but not the entire planet suddenly stopping beneath them. Bridges would twist apart as their supports experience forces from directions they were never meant to survive. Roads and railways would fracture as the crust, vehicles, and infrastructure react differently to the sudden loss of rotation. Power plants, airports, dams, and industrial zones would fail almost instantly, cutting off the systems cities depend on. Underground pipelines would rupture, gas lines would explode, and water systems would break beneath cities already being torn apart. Even buildings that stayed standing would lose power, water, communication, and access to emergency services within minutes. Cities would become traps, filled with debris, fire, flooding, broken roads, and no reliable way to move or communicate. The collapse would not be local. It would happen across every continent at nearly the same terrifying moment. In seconds, the infrastructure that took centuries to build would become powerless against the physics beneath it. If Earth stopped rotating, the familiar cycle of day and night would break in a way life was never built to handle. Instead of 24-hour days, one side of the planet could face the sun for months at a time. The opposite side would remain trapped in darkness, losing heat until entire regions became frozen and nearly unlivable. The sunlit side would become brutally hot, drying rivers, killing crops, and turning landscapes into expanding deserts. Meanwhile, the dark side would become colder every day, with ice spreading across cities, forests, oceans, and farmland. Between these extremes, a narrow twilight zone might become one of the only places where survival remains possible. But even that zone would be unstable, battered by winds, temperature differences, and collapsing climate systems. Plants, animals, and humans would lose the rhythm of time that once shaped sleeping, growing, feeding, and migration. Civilization would have to migrate toward narrow habitable regions while abandoning vast areas to heat or ice. A stopped Earth would not just change time, it would turn day and night into two different kinds of disaster. After Earth stopped spinning, the atmosphere would begin reorganizing itself around a planet that no longer moves beneath it. The weather patterns we know today depend on rotation, because spinning helps shape winds, storms, and global circulation. Without rotation, the Coriolis effect would collapse, and storms would no longer behave the way they do now. Hurricanes, jet streams, and trade winds would weaken, shift, or disappear, while new violent weather systems formed differently. Air would flow more directly between hot and cold regions, creating massive pressure differences across the planet. The boundary between the burning day side and frozen night side could become a zone of extreme winds and storms. Rainfall would become unpredictable, with some regions drying completely while others are trapped beneath violent storm systems. Climate zones would no longer follow familiar patterns, making agriculture, migration, and survival planning almost impossible. The planet would still have weather, but it would be weather from a broken system no species was prepared for. A stopped Earth would not just change the ground beneath us, it would break the sky above us too. Earth's rotation is also connected to one of its most important invisible protections, the magnetic field surrounding our planet. This magnetic field helps shield Earth from charged particles streaming from the sun and dangerous radiation from space. The field is created deep inside Earth, where moving molten metal helps generate a planetary dynamo. If rotation suddenly stopped, scientists would not expect the magnetic field to vanish instantly, but the system could become unstable. Over time, a disrupted dynamo could weaken the shield that protects the atmosphere, technology, and life on the surface. Satellites would become more vulnerable, power grids could face stronger space weather effects, and communication systems might fail more often. If the magnetic protection weakened enough, radiation at higher altitudes and polar regions could become a more serious threat. The atmosphere would still protect life from much radiation, but losing magnetic stability would add another layer of danger. This would not be the first disaster people noticed, but it could become one of the most dangerous long-term consequences. A stopped Earth would damage not only the surface, but also the invisible systems that quietly protect life every day. Long after the first disasters, the stopped Earth would become a new planet with new rules for survival. Ecosystems would collapse because plants, animals, and microbes depend on stable sunlight, temperature, water, and seasonal cycles. Many species would disappear quickly, not because one thing failed, but because every connected system changed at once. Agriculture would become almost impossible outside narrow survival zones, as heat, darkness, storms, and water shifts destroy predictability. Human calendars would lose meaning because days, nights, seasons, and migration patterns would no longer follow familiar rhythms. Trade routes would collapse as coastlines changed, oceans moved, weather became hostile, and cities lost their original purpose. Civilization would shrink toward the few regions where temperature, water, energy, and shelter could still be controlled. Instead of adapting Earth to us, humanity would be forced to adapt itself to a broken Earth. The planet would still exist, but the world humans built on top of its rotation would be gone. Earth stopping would reveal that civilization depends not only on land and air, but on motion itself. Could humans survive on a stopped Earth? The answer is yes, but only in very limited and controlled environments. The safest places would not be the old cities, but regions where temperature, water, and energy could still be managed. Survivors would need underground shelters, controlled farms, reliable power, protected water systems, and constant atmospheric monitoring. Surface life would be dangerous almost everywhere because wind, temperature extremes, flooding, and radiation risks would remain unstable. Humanity would no longer spread across the planet freely. It would cluster around a few narrow pockets of survivable conditions. Food would have to be grown artificially because ordinary farming would collapse outside the few regions still stable enough for life. Water would become one of the most valuable resources, especially as oceans, rivers, and coastlines move away from familiar places. The strongest communities would be those with engineering, discipline, energy storage, food systems, and the ability to repair everything. But even if humans survived, the civilization we recognize today would be gone beyond repair. Survival would not mean saving the world. It would mean learning how to live on a planet that no longer works like Earth. Earth feels still beneath our feet, but that stillness is an illusion created by a planet moving perfectly with us. Every ocean, wind current, weather system, and living rhythm depends on motion we almost never notice. If that motion ended instantly, the first disaster would be violent, but the deeper collapse would last far longer. The air would tear across continents, oceans would redraw the map, and cities would collapse under forces they were never built for. Day and night would become weapons, climate would break, and the magnetic systems protecting Earth could weaken over time. Humanity might survive in small controlled zones, but the world we call civilization would be almost impossible to rebuild. The terrifying truth is that Earth does not need to feel fast for its motion to keep us alive. We live on a moving world, protected by speed, shaped by rotation, and balanced by forces we barely understand. Maybe the real question is not what happens if Earth stops, but how fragile everything is while it keeps moving. Because Earth does not feel like it is moving until one day, in this impossible scenario, it stops.